There are names that echo through Appalachia, like curses names spoken low, with eyes cast toward the ground, as though saying them aloud might summon shadows from the woods. The Lawson family was one of those names. To their neighbors, they were not merely poor, not merely strange, they were feared. Their land was avoided, their cabins skirted by hunters, their presence met with silence. For behind their rotting walls, the Lawsons carried a darkness no one dared confront. A lineage twisted inward, a hunger that could not be satisfied, and a shame so unbearable it turned them into monsters in the eyes of the world. Some said they were inbred, others swore they were cannibals, and in the whispers of Appalachia, both were true. This is their story, the disturbing tale of the Lawson family. The hollows of North Carolina have always been a place of silence, a land of shadows where stories linger longer than daylight. It is here, among the dense forests and narrow paths, carved into red earth, that the name Lawson began to curl into whispers of fear. Their cabin stood at the edge of a hollow, slumped against the trees like a wounded animal, its walls rotting, its porch collapsing under years of neglect. But what frightened the neighbors was not the ruin of the house, it was what the ruin concealed. Those who passed too close to the Lawson property claimed to smell it first,
to my channel.
a sour, greasy smoke that clung to the wind, unlike the scent of cooking meat, too heavy, too wrong. Then came the noises, low groans, like someone in endless pain, drifting through the trees. Sometimes laughter childlike, but hollow, as if born from mouths that had forgotten how to shape joy. The Lawsons were not newcomers. Their roots went deep into the soil, tangled with generations of secrecy. For decades, they had married only within themselves, brother to sister, cousin to cousin, until their children bore the marks of that folding bloodline. Faces warped by asymmetry, eyes too close or too far apart, jaws that hung slack, bodies bent or stunted as though shaped by unseen hands. They were pitied at first, pitied and left alone. But hunger and isolation do not allow pity for long. It was during the lean years, when winters stretched too long and crops froze before harvest, that the Lawsons began to slip past the line no one dared imagine. Their animals disappeared first. Chickens, goats, hogs all, slaughtered and eaten long before spring returned. Then, neighbors began to whisper of missing dogs, missing cats, and finally, they began to whisper of missing children. A boy sent on an errand who never returned. A girl who went walking through the woods and vanished into the dark. No evidence, no graves, only absence. And every time, the same glance was cast toward the Lawson Hollow. No one dared accuse them outright. The mountains had a way of swallowing the truth, and the Lawsons themselves never spoke. They kept to their hollow, appearing only rarely in town, shuffling barefoot along dirt roads, clothes filthy, hair tangled, their eyes darting with something more than fear, something animal. When they came to trade, they wanted salt, flour, lard, and meat, always meat, but never enough. Their hunger was endless, a gnawing that consumed not just their stomachs, but their souls. One neighbor, an old farmer, swore that he once saw a sight that haunted him until his death. He had risen before dawn to tend his fields, and on the edge of the woods, he spotted two Lawson children, crouched in the dirt, gnawing at a bone. He thought it was from a deer. But then, when one child turned its head toward him, he saw the bones shape the curve of a human femur, stripped bare, cracked open for marrow. The farmer left his land the very next year, abandoning his home rather than live another season beside the hollow. Inside the cabin, those who dared glimpse it said the walls were smeared with soot and grease, the floor littered with bones that were not always animal. A great iron kettle sat at the center of the single room, blackened with use, smoke staining the rafters above it. Around the fire, figures sat slumped, men with slack jaws, women with tangled hair falling over hollow eyes, children too, still for their age, their limbs oddly bent, their faces marked by the telltale signs of bloodline turned inward. They spoke little, and when they did, their words were broken, half whispers, half animal sounds, as though language itself had been lost in their isolation. The Lawsons did not see themselves as monsters. Hunger drove them, shame silenced them, and the outside world had long since abandoned them. The church stopped visiting their hollow, and the schools had given up teaching their children decades before. They were left to themselves, to the law of survival, to a darkness that deepened with every winter. What began as desperation became tradition. What began as taboo became inheritance. And so the name Lawson became less a family than a warning. Children were told not to wander near their land. Hunters swore they would not follow deer into that hollow, no matter how large the buck or how long they had tracked it. Travelers gave the area wide berth. The Lawson name was a curse that clung to the Appalachian air, heavy and unshakable, whispered like a prayer against the night. Still, stories persisted. Strange fires seen burning in the woods, bones scattered on the trails, voices calling from the trees, mimicking the cries of lost children. And in the center of it all, the Lawson family remained, watching, waiting, feeding, their lives bound by blood, by hunger, and by secrets too terrible to speak aloud. The longer the Lawson family remained in their hollow, the more their story grew not just as fact, but as a legend that bled into nightmare. Fear traveled faster than truth in the Appalachian hills, carried in whispers from porch to porch, church to church, fire pit to fire pit, and every telling added a darker shade, every silence a heavier weight. By the time a child was old enough to walk, they already knew the warning: don't stray near the Lawson place. Don't follow the voices in the woods. Don't answer when someone calls your name from the dark. But whispers are not enough to keep every soul safe. One autumn, a traveling peddler was said to have gone missing on the road that wound near the Lawson Hollow. His cart was found overturned in the ditch, goods scattered and picked clean, the wheels snapped as though forced. His body was never recovered. Some said he had been waylaid by bandits, but the older folks shook their heads. Bandits take coin and leave the rest. This was different. It was the Lawsons who lingered in every glance, their rotting cabin, like a mouth that swallowed without spitting back. By winter, hunters began to report strange discoveries. One claimed to have found a half-buried rib cage at the base of a tree, pale bone jutting out of red clay like a warning post. Another swore he stumbled upon a child's shoe, deep in the forest, gnawed through as though by teeth, the leather stiff, with something darker than mud. They carried these tales back to town, speaking in hushed tones over lantern-lit tables. And each time, the silence that followed was heavier than the words themselves. The Lawsons rarely ventured into town, but when they did, their appearances only deepened the dread. A boy with crossed eyes and a twisted leg would shuffle barefoot through the general store, clutching a sack of cornmeal, staring at the floor as though the weight of daylight itself was unbearable. A woman, her face marked with scars that looked more like burns than birth, would stand at the edge of the counter, her tangled hair hiding most of her expression, her hands trembling as she reached for salt or lard. The shopkeepers handed them what they asked for, always quickly, always without small talk. Coins clinked softly on the wood. No one ever counted them. No one wanted to touch them. The moment they left, the air seemed to breathe easier. The sheriff himself knew better than to stir trouble with the Lawsons. He had heard the stories, same as everyone else. Once, in his early years, he tried to make a visit, after rumors spread that a child had gone missing near the hollow. He rode his horse into the woods, the air tightening with every step, until he reached the sagging porch of the Lawson cabin. He knocked once, twice. No answer. But behind the door, he swore he heard movement, shuffling whispers, the sound of something wet dragged across wood, then silence. And from the woods behind him, a rustling, several figures standing just beyond the tree line, watching. He turned his horse and left without a word, never to return again. In town, he said, nothing of what he had seen, only that the hollow was best left alone. And so, the Lawsons grew into something more than human in the minds of their neighbors. They were no longer just a family. They were a specter, a curse, a thing that lived half in this world and half in some other realm of shame and hunger. Parents evoked their name to discipline children. Behave, or the Lawsons will take you. Campfire stories painted them as phantoms that stalked the night, dragging wanderers into the woods to be boiled in their kettle, gnawed to marrow. But what made the fear unbearable was the knowledge unspoken, yet certain that behind the horror, there was truth. The bones found in the leaves were real. The children who vanished were never returned. And in the dead of night, when the smoke rose faintly from the hollow and drifted toward the sky, those who smelled it on the wind could not shake the thought that the Lawsons were feasting once again. Inside their cabin, the family lived as though the outside world had already forgotten them. The generations had blurred into one long thread of hunger and survival. Sons had become fathers, daughters had become wives, bloodlines coiling tighter, with each year until the children no longer resembled those beyond the hollow. Their bodies bore the marks of generations, folded inward spines, twisted limbs uneven, faces marked by strange asymmetry. But what marked them most deeply was not their appearance, it was their eyes. Eyes that seemed older than their years, eyes that had seen too much hunger, too much shame, too much of what should never have been. The kettle remained at the center of everything, always burning, always fed. Some said the Lawsons worshipped it as though it were an altar. Others believed it was simply survival, stripped bare of morality, reduced to hunger and smoke. But the truth was buried with them, as all truths are in the mountains. What remained was only fear, thick as the fog that clung to their hollow. And so the Lawsons endured, season after season, year after year. Their horror was never spoken in open daylight, only carried in whispers through the dark. But in the Appalachian hills, whispers last longer than stone, and the Lawson name twisted, feared, unspeakable would echo long after the family itself had vanished into the shadows of time. There comes a point when a family becomes less flesh and bone and more echoless real than the fear they inspire. By the time the 20th century pushed further into the hills, the Lawson family had become that echo. People no longer spoke of them as neighbors, but as phantoms. The cabin was said to stand half-rotted, its boards curling inward like ribs of a carcass. Windows were broken, doors sagging, yet smoke was still seen rising at odd hours. No one dared enter, no one dared linger. Even hunters who tracked game into the hollow would turn back, rifles lowered, muttering prayers under their breath. It was said that the Lawsons had turned wholly feral by then. Children who ventured too close claimed to see pale figures darting between the trees, hair matted, feet bare, movements crooked and jerking like broken marionettes. Sometimes, a guttural cry echoed through the woods, half human, half animal, and once in a while, the sound of laughter, high-pitched and hollow, like the voice of a child who had never known innocence. Such things were never confirmed, but in the mountains, truth mattered less than the weight of what people felt, and what they felt was dread. One story, retold in hushed tones around campfires, spoke of a preacher who, against warnings, set out to bring salvation to the hollow. With his Bible in hand and cross around his neck, he walked the dirt path toward the Lawson home. The townsfolk watched him disappear into the woods, their faces drawn tight. He never returned. Days later, someone swore they saw his cross nailed above the Lawson doorframe, but no one was brave enough to go and see. In time, even that story became too frightening to tell, buried under silence. By then, the Lawsons had ceased to be individuals. Their names were forgotten, their faces blurred. They became a single shadowed figure in the collective imagination of family without end, feeding on itself, feeding on others, feeding on fear. Their world was candlelit rooms and iron kettles, locked doors and shuttered windows. Theirs was a kingdom of shadows in a hollow that never saw peace. And yet, all kingdoms fall. The day came when no more smoke rose from the chimney, no more figures stirred in the trees. The forest began to reclaim the land, roots splitting the porch, vines threading through the beams. Owls nested in the rafters, where once the Lawson had sat. The cabin sagged further, until it was little more than a heap of gray boards and a half-buried kettle. The family had vanished. Some said they starved. Others said they turned on one another until none remained. And still others whispered that they had simply slipped deeper into the hills, continuing their hunger where no eyes could follow. But the legend endured. Parents still warned their children not to wander after dark. Campfire stories still painted the Lawsons as hunters in the night, and whenever bones were found in the woods, animal or otherwise, the name would rise again. Carried like smoke through the hollows, the Lawsons, what makes their story linger is not only the horror of what they may have done, but the silence that surrounded them. No one dared confront them. No one dared stop them. A whole community chose instead to look away, to bury the truth under generations of whispers. And in that silence, the Lawson family was allowed to become Mython, American nightmare stitched from secrecy, shame, and fear. Even now, when the fog drapes heavy across the Appalachians and the woods seem to lean closer, some swear they hear them. The faint crack of a twig, the sound of something wet boiling, a child's laugh where no child should be, and when that sound rises, they walk faster, whispering a prayer, never daring to look back, because, in the dark, there are names best left unspoken, and the Lawsons were one of them.